K-cars, the awesome cars that saved Chrysler in the Oh no, wait, that's the wrong episode. K-cars, the tiny, fuel-efficient and ultra-practical cars from Japan. What's up with these boxy little cars, and why do they only ride around in Japan and live in obscurity almost everywhere else? Welcome everyone to episode 52 of the Automotive History series, where we're going to put the small and quirky Japanese K-cars under the magnifying glass. After two definitive blows, Japan surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945, effectively ending the Second World War in Asia. Like many European countries, Japan was left in ruins and had to rebuild. Under the watchful eye of the American occupancy, the Japanese government chose to rapidly modernize the country's society, industry, economy, and infrastructure. This is a type of movement I have seen before in other countries in earlier episodes I made about their respective car industry, and usually a fully functioning car industry was the thing to have during these years. But Japan didn't really have a fully functioning national car industry. Mind you, national. And even if they did have a car industry, they had no one to sell cars to. A regular passenger car sold for as much as 5 annual salaries back then and was taxed into oblivion. Only the rich and wealthy, companies and government agencies could afford regular passenger cars. The average man traveled around using a motorcycle, bicycle, or his own 2 feet. This was going nowhere, and the Japanese government sought ways to give the crippling car industry a boost. Something along the lines of a people's car, much like Germany had with the Volkswagen Beetle. The government figured that in order to keep the cost of ownership low, the car had to be small, fuel efficient, lightweight, and just a small step away from a motorcycle. Kinda like a microcar. This follows the same pattern what happened in Europe around the same time. Since many countries that were affected by the war had to take care of some other things before splurging money on fancy cars, some car companies jumped into the temporary and profitable niche market of microcars. Cars that bridged the gap between compact economy cars and mopeds and motorcycles, and were usually nothing more than 2 motorcycles glued together. Depending on the regulations in that particular country, many of these microcars were still defined by the law as some sort of motorcycle or quadricycle, with all the low-cost tax benefits and insurance rates that came along with it. I made an entire episode about these funny little cars if you want to know more about them. The Japanese government figured that the microcar theme would be a right choice to jumpstart its auto industry. Simple, fuel-efficient, cost-effective, and its manufacturing doesn't require a whole lot of resources and materials which were still scarce. By the start of the 1950s, the Japanese government set up several laws that would help the car industry, including the Road and Vehicle Act of 1951. In this law, passenger cars would be divided into 3 groups, based on vehicle dimensions. You had normal-sized passenger cars, the largest of the bunch, with lengths over 4.7 meters, or 15 feet, but below 6 meters, or 19 feet, and also requirements for the width and height. Engines should have a displacement over 2 liters. Then you had small-sized passenger cars. These cars were a step below the normal-sized cars, with a maximum length of 4.7 meters, and an engine displacement of a maximum of 2 liters. And then you had the last category, light cars, and there it is, the smallest group of vehicles, named keijidosha, or K-cars as we know it. These cars had a maximum length of 3 meters, almost 10 feet, a maximum width of 1.3 meters, or just over 4 feet, and a maximum height of 2 meters, or 6.5 feet. There was also a maximum engine displacement, both for 2-stroke and 4-stroke engines. In 1951, the 4-stroke displacement was capped at 360 cubic centimeters. Adjusted to inflation, that's about 0.36 liters of displacement or 22 cubic inch. Originally, the government ordered that the people's car could be made by the industry if it met the conditions of the K-car vehicle class, and on top of that, weigh less than 400 kilos, a fuel efficiency of 30 kilometers per liter, and all that with a retail price of 150,000 yen, or about 6,000 bucks today. Car makers reacted saying, "Boy, what a great idea, but we could never meet those rules altogether." But after some back and forth arguing and discussing, the rules were stretched a bit and the targeted retail price was raised, and the first K car was born, the 1955 Suzuki Suzulite. The Suzu Light was Suzuki's first entry into the four-wheel business after only having experience in making motorcycles. The car made full use of the possibilities within the K-car regulations by featuring a 6.7-liter V8 making 200... that was a Freudian slip. The Suzuki was powered by an ever-so-humble 360cc two-cylinder two-stroker that made 16 horsepower. So practically a motorcycle engine installed in a metal body that happens to have four wheels. More Japanese car companies figured out how to meet the K-car requirements and joined Suzuki in the quest for making the people's car. Subaru released their first car, the 360, in 1958, and the 360 was a reference to the 360cc engine, and after a couple years, a savvy American businessman managed to import them to the United States and actually pass them on as quadricycles, and not as actual passenger cars. And I have an episode ready for that story too. After Suzuki and Subaru, more companies followed, like Mazda with the R360 Coupe and Daihatsu with the Fellow. By the 1960s, European car makers had abandoned the microcar business in favor of the slightly more substantial people's cars, like the Fiat 500, the Austin Mini, and the Citroën 2 Chevaux. Still small, but not as small as a microcar. But Japan looked the other way. K-cars were getting more and more popular. What started out as only a couple cars a day turned into a few thousand per month. And this led to an entirely unique realm of its own. The K-cars were a reflection of regular passenger car market, with all its variations and flavors, only smaller. Let me explain. As soon as the car makers had their regular passenger K-cars up and running, it was time to expand in other markets. For instance, the commercial car business proved lucrative. Think of pickups, light trucks, and delivery vans. But also tiny off-roaders, like the Suzuki Jimny, and also this, whatever this is supposed to be. Usually, Japanese car makers would not only offer a passenger version of the K-cars, but a complete line of models, including pickup trucks and vans. These vans were later known as microvans, like the Suzuki Sambar, and micro pickups, like the Honda T500. But the real fun stuff came in the shape and form of roadsters and sports cars. Because why wouldn't you have a little fun on a tight budget? Strictly speaking, these sports cars are not K-cars. Their dimensions usually fit some of the maximum restrictions of the K-car class, but their engines wouldn't. I mean, let's face it, you can make a car as lightweight as possible, but you'd be very, optimistic if you can get any decent power if you have only a maximum of 360 cc's to work with. But whether K-cars or not, I wanted to mention them because they do fall into a peculiar vehicle class, that is the ultra-compact sports car. Datsun was among the first in 1960 with the Datsun Sports. Honda would follow in 1962 with the S360, which was a functional prototype but not an actual production car. Honda decided to skip the regular passenger car altogether and went straight for the fun stuff. Good thinking. As I said, the car never made it to production, but was replaced by the slightly larger version, the S500 in 1963, with a 500cc engine, producing more power but no longer meeting the K-car requirements. For its day, the engine was high-tech, dual overhead cams, revving up to an astonishing 9,000 RPM. That is like 1960s Formula 1 territory. And others quickly followed, like Toyota with the Sports 800 in 1965. In the meantime, regular K-cars received styling and technical updates, embracing the 60s modernist look, sometimes with a touch of Austin Mini in it. Suzuki sold you the tiny Fronte, Honda the N360, and Mitsubishi the Minica. But here is where it gets interesting. As much as the automotive world in the late 60s was caught up in the horsepower wars with pony cars, muscle cars, and sports coupes, and the average car gaining more power and getting faster each year, the K-cars lagged behind, and the difference in performance could lead to unsafe situations, like merging onto the highway. And yet, you're not going to believe this, a little muscle car war started to break out in the world of K-cars. Car makers tried to squeeze every last horse out of the last cubic centimeter they had to work with, and cars like the Daihatsu Fellow Max SS, yes, this bad boy right here, was the ultimate muscle machine. 35 to 40 horsepower were pretty big numbers in those days, with a 0 to 100 kilometers, or 0 to 60 miles an hour time, of a heart-stopping 17 seconds, and a top speed of 120 kilometers an hour. Around 1970, K cars experienced peak popularity, accounting to as much as 30% of the total amount of cars sold in Japan. But times were changing. New emissions, fuel economy, and safety regulations were coming up. And although fuel consumption wasn't an issue at all, the other regulations were. With a regular passenger car, you have some wiggle room in the engine bay and it's designed to adapt to the new technology and safety measurements, like bigger bumpers. But with K cars that were built to the nearest millimeter, it didn't leave any room for bigger bumpers or thicker pillars. If K cars would manage to compete with the new rules, they'd essentially be nothing more than a bumper on four wheels. This, along with the government trying to make K-car class less appealing, led to various car makers doubting whether they could realistically continue with their small model series. Honda and Mazda decided to jump the ship and leave the K-car business. Other car makers addressed these challenges, and eventually the government gave in. In 1976, the Japanese government decided to stretch the rules and opted for larger dimensions and engine sizes. K cars were now allowed to be 20 centimeters longer, 10 centimeters wider, and engine displacement was bumped up from 360 cubic centimeters to a whopping 550 cc's, much to the surprise of the car manufacturers, as they expected to not go over 500 cc's, and already designed engines based on this size. The new rules stimulated the K-car market. After a dip around the mid-1970s, sales rose again, and by 1980 a new all-time high hit with 1.2 million K-cars sold. And in the 1980s, the K-car slowly moved away from its humble origins as it became more luxurious and less basic. Turbocharging found its way under the hood, and air conditioning and automatic transmission in the interior. Some car makers boosted their sales of commercial vehicles by converting them into tiny vans for personal use, like mini minivans. By the start of the 1990s, the Japanese government once again stretched the K-car rules, allowing it to grow another 10 centimeters in length and even larger engines, growing from 550 to 660 cc's. These changes were made during the tail end of the Japanese economic bubble, to accommodate the need for ever more luxurious and upscale K-cars. This was also an answer to the ever-growing performance numbers. A maximum power output was suggested, but never strictly imposed. Instead, a gentleman's agreement decided that K-cars could be powered by a maximum of 64 horses. With an engine of 600 cc's and all the latest and greatest technology to boost the performance, this led to the reintroduction of the K sports car. Honda was back into the game with the Honda Beat, Suzuki returned with the Suzuki Cappuccino, and the last one is arguably the most notable of the bunch, the AutoZone AZ1. This fella is a unique approach in that it is mid-engines, as far that it is possible on such a short length. It had pop-up headlights and gull-wing doors, and a power output of 64 horsepower, keeping it perfectly in check with the gentleman's agreement. Essentially, the K-car version of a Lamborghini. Most of these roadsters were popular in the first year, but that quickly dropped as soon as the Japanese economy collapsed in the early 90s and entered what was now known as the lost decade. With the increase in size and engine performance, many regular K cars started to get dangerously close to the city car, or A-segment cars of Europe. The A-segment is a segment where car makers usually keep the smallest offerings. Think of the Volkswagen Up or the Ford Ka. And that begs the question, if they are so similar, have there been K cars that were officially sold in Europe and other parts of the world? And have there been European cars so small that they qualify as a K car in Japan and have been sold as such? The answer to both these questions is actually yes. A small percentage of K cars were sold outside Japan, as they were the right fit for developing countries where car ownership in and on itself was an exclusivity. But they were also officially sold here in Europe, usually marketed as the absolute bottom of the barrel cheap economy car, for those that think a Peugeot 107 is far too luxurious. The Subaru Vivio was officially sold in Europe as a compact hatchback. The Suzuki Wagon R found its way to Europe, and a slightly larger version was rebadged as an Opel or Vauxhall Agila. The Suzuki Alto was also sold overseas and became a cult classic in India and was sold over there as the Maruti 800. And last but not least, Daihatsu sold the Mira or Kuore for a while. And I've sat once in one of these, and it truly reminds you that you are in a car. Almost nothing was done to spice things up a bit or hide the fact that you're in a metal box. And then there are cars that are offered in two versions. A smaller version that meets the K-car requirements back in Japan, and a slightly larger version specifically for export markets, like the Suzuki Jimny. And so have there been cars made by a European car maker that could pass on as a K-car? Yes. Smart. See, the dimensions of the Smart City Coupe fell almost into the K-car category. The car was shorter than the maximum length, and the engine size met the requirements, but oh no, what a disaster! It was a massive 3 centimeters too wide. Smart then modified the car to be slightly narrower to meet the K-car regulations, and sold it as the Smart K in Japan, but it was met with very limited success. In 1998, the Japanese government made the last revisions to the K-car regulations. The cars were allowed to be another 10 centimeters longer and 8 centimeters wider, but no change in engine displacement. Most K-cars evolved from being a hatchback to fully utilize the given dimensions, turning them into a small box-like vehicle, kinda like a miniature minivan, with sliding doors. And joke all you want about their dumpy appearance, but space utilization is superb, and you can't say that of some other vehicle types on the road. I was curious to see how much these cars differ in size from a European city car, but as it turns out, K-cars remain really small. Compare it to a Volkswagen Up, which is also very boxy in its appearance, but you'll see that the V-dubs is 10 centimeters longer than the maximum length, quite a lot wider, but substantially lower than a K-car. Naturally, engines are also larger and more powerful, usually starting at 1 liter of displacement. But cars like these are a good point of reference that actually tells you just how small these K-cars are. It's hard to tell from normal pictures because they look like ordinary normal-sized vans. The Japanese government decided to lower the financial advantages of owning a K-car in 2014. They raised the sales tax, the tax on gasoline, and also raised the tax of owning a K-car as much as 50%, making the step to upgrade to a bigger car smaller and smaller. Various Japanese car makers still offer K-cars, almost exclusively in the boxy shape or as a truck and van. These cars are practically the same as larger cars, same equipment, touchscreens, automatic transmission, sensors all around, and contemporary styling. But since the cost of development challenges the very slim profit margins, combined with the lower tax benefits, some of these K-cars are rebadged, like the Daihatsu Tanto that is also sold as a Subaru Chiffon. Here in Europe and in other countries, the K-car lives its life in obscurity. Not many people know about these cars until they go to Japan. And most won't know that some of these cars have been sold over here, but presented as an even cheaper economy car. And so it seems like that these cars are either driven by A, anime-loving edgy meme lords, or B, your Aunt Jenny, who, despite its very compact dimensions, still manages to park it unsuccessfully at the first try. But a small group of dedicated enthusiasts has emerged, and is growing, that like these cars for their obscurity and quirkiness, and sometimes simply like it because of their fun experience, but without breaking the bank, like the Daihatsu Copen. Who knows, the popularity of the K-car might be dwindling in its home country, but could start to live a second life in other parts of the world.